Okay.
Can you share those housekeeping notes too?
What's that?
Can you share the housekeeping notes too?
They are in a folder that everybody should have access to. But that being said, I will send that out to you direct, just so you know where they're at. Boom. All right. So yeah, we got to understand how all the different components in the ecosystem relate to each other so we can anticipate the effects of our actions. You know, there's a whole lot of diversity of living organisms on the planet. And if we're going to start exploring the complex and interdependent relationships with nature, we should kind of look at the classification systems. There are two large different classification systems by physiological differences and genetic evolution, and by their ecological function. So in the sciencey taxonomy type world, you have this whole Latin classification system, and we all learned a little about it in high school, and perhaps a bit more in post-secondary. But basically, you're looking at the kingdom and then down to phylums and classes and orders and families and genus and individual species. And that's that big Latin taxonomy system that's been around for centuries in Western science. And it's primarily based on grouping organisms together with similar physiological traits, but it does not address whatsoever anything that they do in their ecosystem or their environment. It's just grouping animals, well, I wouldn't say just animals, but grouping organisms together just based on their physiological traits. And we'll get into that kingdom category a little further. The kingdom category is, well, for a long time, it was divided into 2 and sometimes 3 different categories. But in more modern times, it's been expanded into 5 different kingdoms. So the original 2 and sometimes 3 categories were animals and plants. And then sometimes they, some branches of science would include the very small things called Protistas. But then recently, you know, it's probably not all that recently, but I mean, like recently in terms of like human Western science, evolutionary thinking here, it's expanded into 5 different kingdoms to include bacteria and fungi, animals, plants, and Protista. So let's take a little bit of a dive into each of those. In the bacteria world, I was telling you about like one handful of soil or healthy soil or healthy compost can contain like millions of bacteria. And so here's some of that stat here. The University of Virgin, which I don't know where in the world that is, they claim that 1 gram of soil contains approximately 10,000 different species of bacteria, not individual bacteria, but like different species of bacteria. And to date, there's been only about 10,000 species of bacteria that have been described, yet there may be hundreds of millions out there, according to Heidi Hermary and her research. Bacteria freely exchange cellular content, including DNA, and that's where people become worried about all these GMO things that are happening. Recently, I was just reading about GMO mosquitoes being released in Florida to control, I think it was the Zika virus. Yeah, that's particularly worrisome to me. Yeah. So I was talking about, I've talked about GMO cotton before, and I've talked about BT before, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. This, I think this was like back on our very first day, we were doing a farm safety talk in the greenhouse. We were talking about different certified organic insecticides and herbicides that are used and approved in the certified organic world that we don't use here. And Bacillus thuringiensis was one of them. That is something that is natural in nature. Some plants produce this Bacillus thuringiensis, but they produce it only in certain plants and only in small amounts. But science has managed to extract it and concentrate it. And GMO cotton are like insert it, basically insert that gene into plants that didn't normally exude BT, such as cotton and corn, I know are two big ones that have this Bacillus thuringiensis inside of them. So when the GMO cotton or corn is planted, they exude this BT, this Bacillus thuringiensis, into the soil, and then it changes the soil microbiology. So even though you're not, in theory, needing to spray these plants anymore because insects won't naturally eat them because of the Bacillus thuringiensis, and if they do eat them, they die, the insects. And so it looks like, oh, look, we don't have to spray this with insecticides anymore, but it's exuding that into the soil, and it's killing soil microbiology. It's it's a worrisome thing. And that was not the intention of introducing BT to these plants. That was a side effect that people didn't see when they were doing these kind of projects. And then this kind of stuff just kind of gets out there in nature and you can't put it back in. All right, so in the fungi category, so far there's been 47,000 different species of fungi that have been described, but there's probably more than that out there yet. Fungi are more closely related to animals than plants, which is an interesting little thing. They are filamentous, and so the mycelium of the fungus is basically like the roots of the fungus. Well, sometimes when you dig in the soil, you can see that those mycelium roots, long filaments going through the soil, and they can be huge, absolutely huge. The part of the mushroom that you see that comes above the ground or on a tree stump or wherever it happens to be is actually a very small part of that mushroom. Here it says that there has been single fungal organisms over hundreds of miles, which is incredible. Fungi, when they dissolve and decompose various things that they feed on, they transform nutrients into compounds into a form that is available to plants, which is why I don't mind those funguses in the greenhouse, which need to be weeded, by the way. We got a lot of mushrooms coming up. I spent some time doing that this morning, but more need to get done. As those funguses are growing in that greenhouse environment, they're breaking down different food that they feed on in those planters and making nutrients available to plants. And so that's why I'm resistant to treating those planters with an antifungal spray. Like you can get certified organic antifungal sprays, but I am very resistant to doing that because I think those funguses are doing a good thing in those planters and making nutrients available to plants. But at the same time, they're also, giving us trouble dislocating plants as they sprout up so much. But as long as we stay on top of them and pick them out when they're real young, I think they're doing us more good than harm, and I'm willing to leave them be in there. So here's an interesting part. Funguses are the world's only organism that can digest woody compounds. Funguses evolved 200 million years after woody trees, woody organisms such as trees, I maybe should say. So there was 200 million years on the earth where when these trees fell down due to different processes or whatnot and died due to different processes, there was nothing to decompose them. And that's the reason that we have fossil fuels today, is because all of these woody organisms, all of these big old trees from back in the day have all been buried by different layers of soil over time and are deep within the earth. And that's where we get all of our oil from. And that's why oil is a limited resource, because now mushrooms break down trees. But there was 200 million years in Earth's history where all of these trees and different vegetative material just got buried and were not decomposed by funguses. Then funguses evolved, and as these different trees now fall down, they get decomposed, and a whole little system happens. But there was a time on Earth where that didn't happen. And that's the reason that we have all the fossil fuels that we have. And that's the reason why fossil fuels are a limited resource, because they'll never happen again. It was just that perfect environment that they did exist in. Another category here is the Protista. And this is a bit of a miscellaneous category made up of about 60,000 species to date. They're always adding more. Them scientists always busy at it. At present, these life forms defy classification. We gotta love that, right? Heidi predicts that there's going to be a lot of research and a lot of changes to this category into the future. Some examples here are single-celled amoebas, slime molds, and multi-celled algae. Matt's pulling up. Another category here in the kingdom world is animals, of course. There is a wide diversity of species, over 1 million to date. The animal kingdom can range from microscopic worms to bisons and whales. Some have interior skeletons and some have exterior skeletons. Some do live birth and some do birth through eggs. I don't know if you call that birth, but some reproduce through eggs. Food uptake is through a mouth or other opening, and digestion is internal. I don't think that's news to anybody there. Now, this one here I always like, and I like studies and reading about this, but that animals in and of themselves are symbiotic organisms. They are living, walking ecosystems. Their animals are entirely dependent on microbial populations externally and internally for your well-being. And that, of course, relates to humans as well. All of those microbes are not there by accident. They all perform vital functions to aid in digestion and vitamin synthesis and so on. And there's been a lot of research lately about that gut health and all the different organisms that live in your guts and how they help you digest and absorb enzymes and break the food down and whatnot. And if you are lacking in one of those or lacking in some of those, then that can relate to different diseases. And I love that kind of realm, and I find it fascinating. Yeah, we'll leave that at that. Plant kingdom, approximately 250,000 species to date. And plants, just like animals, also form symbiotic relationships with many microbial and animal populations. Bacteria and fungi play a vital role in plant nutrient uptake and plant defense. And that's what we're trying to grow as regenerative farmers. We are trying to grow the bacteria and funguses. And that in turn will feed our plants. I used to know a cattle farmer, and his line was, I don't grow cattle. Oh, he was a grass-fed and finished beef farmer. So he was just raising his cattle on beef. So he's just raising his beef cattle on grass and grass only, so out on pasture. And so he had a saying where he's like, I don't raise cattle, I just raise grass. And then as long as I'm raising grass well and growing grass well, then my cattle will do just fine. And that's kind of the same point of view with regenerative farming. We're not growing tomatoes or cabbage or carrots. That's the end result of actively growing our beneficial bacteria and funguses here. We do well growing the bacteria and funguses that our potatoes and cabbage and tomatoes and whatnot will all do very well for us. So our takeaway here from our dive into the 5 animal kingdoms is that the higher life forms, the animals and plants, are actually compound life forms. They have that symbiotic relationship, walking ecosystems. And those higher life forms are collaborations between many different organisms and are perhaps ecosystems in their own right. So you should view your body as a living, breathing, mobile ecosystem. So if our goal here to try to turn it all back to farming here, if our goal here is to work with nature in agriculture, it is probably better for us to understand the ecological functions of these 5 kingdoms rather than just classifying them on their physiological traits about how they look and how they evolved. So as opposed to that taxonomy system that just groups things by their physiological traits, as we just kind of went over, a good way to examine ecological function is through something called the soil food web. The soil food web is fascinating stuff. It is research by Dr. Ingham is her name. She's the one that kind of introduced this and popularized it several decades ago anyway. And the soil food web has kind of taken off from there. And so when we talk about the soil food web, we're looking at an approach that examines all the different roles and activities of all the different organisms in terms of food cycling within ecosystems. So the soil food web is kind of like the food chain that we used to learn back in grade school about how one animal feeds another animal, who feeds another animal, that animal dies and decomposes, that feeds other things, and then it continues and whatnot. That soil food web is kind of the same kind of process, but you're just looking at the soil in particular. Let's see if we can get a pick up here of soil food web. I don't think I have a good diagram in my slides. Soil food web. So yeah, you're looking at something like this. There's all sorts of things, different insects, the arthropods happening in the soil. You got your different funguses and mycorrhizae in the soil. You got your different nematodes and protozoa in the soil. You got your bacteria and funguses in the soil. You got compost additions, and everything's feeding everything else. You got all these arrows and things are moving around. And this here is a rather simple kind of diagram. There are, of course, many more complex diagrams. What does that one look like? That one looks more complex. Can't get it any larger. But if you were to Google soil food web, you'll get all sorts of different diagrams. And it's essentially that food chain that I was just talking about, but all happening in the soil. There's a whole soil food chain that's happening, and we call that the soil food web. And so scientists have identified over 30 different functional groups in that soil food web. When we talk about functional groups, we're talking about groups of organisms that have their own ecological job within that soil food web. Okay, so if we look at a grassland or a meadow, we'll say, remember, I think I was saying to you guys once upon a time that a meadow is a far better place to establish a garden as opposed to clear cutting a section of woods and establishing a garden. That's because the functional groups in a meadow more closely replicate the functional groups that you want in your garden, as opposed to those functional groups in the forest. They more closely replicate orchards, let's say, than a garden. And it makes sense, right? Trees grow where trees like to grow, and grasses and those kind of plants like to grow where they like to grow. And there's different organisms and different functions that these organisms do in both of these ecosystems. So when we say that a grassland has about 18 different functional groups, we're saying that there's like essentially about 18 different jobs done by all sorts of macro and microorganisms to make that grassland or meadow ecosystem function as well as it does. Whereas shrublands have about 25 functional groups, and deciduous forest about 27, coniferous forest about 30, rainforest about 32, and deserts, where of course there's not as much life, has only about 10 functional groups. Now, we're not going to go into all of these groups here today, but when we talk about functional groups, we're talking about, here's some examples anyway. We're talking about things like primary producers are their own functional groups, and these can be made up of all sorts of different plants. Decomposers, such as protozoa, is another functional group, and there's other decomposers in there, of course. Earthworms can even be considered a decomposer, or maggots, another decomposer. Fungal feeders like mushrooms, they are another functional group in an ecosystem. High-level predators even, I guess I would moving outside of the just soil, but there are high-level predators in the soil as well. Centipedes can be considered a high-level predator in the soil. Centipedes will eat slugs, baby slugs in particular, but centipedes are great to see in your garden because they will eat baby slugs and slug eggs as that too. Here I had an example of raptors, which then they can still play a role in a garden too. If you have like, earlier, like last week or so, I was going on about a garter snake that I saw in my garden at home and how happy I was to see that garter snake. And that garter snake just represents a higher level predator in your garden. And that means your ecosystem is doing extremely well if you're able to encourage and attract these high level predators to the garden. So these are all the different functional groups that are nice to see and all depend on each other for a nice, healthy ecosystem. Getting back here to the book and relating this to some agricultural kind of things, Heidi says that it's impossible to create a healthy lawn or a healthy garden or healthy, you name it, with just 10 functional groups. Remember, we were saying that deserts, because they don't have much life in them, desert being a desert, has less functional groups. So if we have a lawn or a garden or, you name it, any kind of ecosystem that you're trying to create, but you have a very limited amount of functional groups, your ecosystem's kind of broken. You need all of those various groups to all kind of work together. I remember, I think it was our magic number was like 18 different functional groups for grasslands. That's about the same for gardens as well. You need about like those 18 different functional groups. So anytime we remove organic matter from our lawns, such as the grass clippings and the leaves and different residues, or anytime we remove organic matter from our gardens, and this is why I like to have that balance of living and dead things in the garden, anytime we remove any of those that organic matter, we're depriving various functional groups of their food source. And the more often we do this, that functional group will entirely go away. If they have no food source, they can't exist in your garden or your lawn or your whatever ecosystem you're trying to create, because there won't be enough biodiversity to support them. And then you're missing that gap. All of a sudden, your soil food web has a gap that's missing. And then as a grower or as a lawn caretaker or whatever you're looking at, whatever kind of ecosystem, then that falls on you then to try to fix, to have to import nutrients, import inputs in order to replicate what that functional group was doing in the first place. By removing all that different organic matter from our gardens, such as the leaves of our plants or the stalks of our plants and all these kind of things, you are taking away that food source for different groups. And then if you do that often enough, that group is just going to entirely disappear from your garden. And you gotta link in that chain that's broken. That's a good way to look at it. So as a result, then, of course, you're going to need to feed and water your lawn or your garden or whatever ecosystem we're talking about yourself, as opposed to this whole system that could and should be in place that's going to do it for you. That's what we're trying to achieve here. If we talk about grouping organisms by ecological function, I got to keep in mind that the soil food web is one big interdependent food system. All organisms feed on each other, whether they're alive or dead. Every organism's waste in a properly functioning ecosystem, all organisms' waste becomes somebody else's food. Everything's recycled, nothing is wasted, everything has a specific role to fill. And that's what we're trying to duplicate on a regenerative farm. I imagine a lot of this isn't kind of like news to people about the whole like food chain and soil food web. But I mean, it's nice to be able to like think about and dive into a little bit, because that's exactly what we're trying to create in our garden. If we have one of those like nice, neat, clean kind of gardens that a lot of people go for, even certified organic farmers, you're removing a lot of that food from a lot of these organisms, and then it's going to create more work for the gardener in the long term. Now, none of this is exactly quick either. It's going to take years to establish that ecosystem. During those years of establishing that ecosystem, yes, you're still buying in inputs such as organic matter in the form of compost, such as the mulch that we are applying to our beds. Keep in mind, Hayes Farm is this is only our 4th growing season. I'm hoping to get to a point where we don't have to order in compost every year. I'm hoping to get to a point where we can grow our own mulch and use it here on farm. We're not there yet. We're still a young farm. We're still building our ecosystem here. I would imagine it would take probably as much as like 10 years going down this road until you get that whole ecosystem chain fixed and working for you. That movie Little Big Farm, which I have some issues with, they talk about that as well, and they went through different troubles as well on their farm before their ecosystem started catching up and finding ways to deal with slug problems, finding ways to deal with too much loss on their fruit trees from birds, and eventually the raptors moved in and started taking care of their bird problem for them. And these are all those kind of cycles that we're trying to encourage on our farm, nice, healthy ecosystems. I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions so far? Again, I'm trying to go quick, trying to give you an overview of the book. There's a lot here. And like I was saying, all these slides are available to you. If you ever want to take a slower time and go through these things, they're all here. But some good things to talk about, some good things to think about. So yeah, we're still here in chapter 1. So ecosystem elements here. We are talking about the different ecosystems and food chain, soil food web. All ecosystems are made up of essentially 5 elements, talking light, air, soil, water, and temperature. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Light, air, soil, water, and temperature. And different plants, of course, have different light requirements. Some grow in shade, some grow in part sun, some grow in full sun. But light does not equal sunshine. You could have something in a bright spot that is not full sun, you know. Some plants are adapted to harsh and full sun, and other are adapted to shady environments and growing underneath other plants where they'll still receive light, but not exactly full sun. Humans in a garden often place plants where we want them in an ecosystem, but not where they're best suited. And then again, we complain, oh, this plant's not doing very well. But you got to think about these light requirements and sunshine requirements. And we can't exactly push a plant to do something that it's incapable of doing. Air and soil are also another ecosystem element here, of course. Our atmosphere is made up of 17 different gases. 21% of that is oxygen. The distribution of the gases is not uniform. For example, the deeper we dig into the soil, the lower the oxygen content is going to be in the soil. And plant roots need oxygen. Clay soil is a challenge, especially very soggy, saturated clay soil is a challenge because it can become waterlogged and you can deprive plant roots of oxygen. But more specifically, other things that need oxygen in the soil is the bacteria. Remember, we're trying to farm that bacteria, which is going to feed our plants. There are different organisms in the soil, of course, that will require a different oxygen level. The aerobes, those are the things that breathe air, the animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, and protists, need about 21% oxygen levels, which happens to be what is naturally in our atmosphere. So those are all things living above ground, of course. And then things underneath the ground, like different bacteria and protista, can require anywhere from 2 to 10% oxygen. So keep that in mind as we go to our next slide here. And then there you have anaerobic soils that don't need any oxygen at all. And there is organisms and bacteria that thrive in anaerobic environments, and they don't need any oxygen at all, and they only grow in low oxygen. Now, these anaerobic organisms will produce waste products that are toxic to plants. They will produce alcohols and phenols and ethylenes, and many plant pathogens that will harm our plants that we want to grow. They thrive in anaerobic conditions. So we do not want anaerobic soil in the garden. We don't want anaerobic activity in the compost either. We were talking about having too fat of a grass clipping layer, and sometimes air and oxygen is not able to get into it. It turns anaerobic and slimy. Those are things we don't want in the compost. Here at Hayes Farm, when we started in 2018, a lot of our eastern field, the far side of the farmhouse, that had some anaerobic soil. And when we were working with it, with the BCS, I had a subsoil or a hook on there to break up some compacted soil. And I had the rototiller out to get some soil ready. And as you were working it, like you could smell bad smells from the soil, and that's the anaerobic soil. And that anaerobic soil is producing things like alcohols and phenols and ethylenes, and those things are toxic to plants. So anaerobic soil is not something you want in your garden. You want to be able to have oxygen into your soil. Clay soils, like I was saying, especially sodden, saturated clay soils, don't allow a lot of room for oxygen. And that is a reason that we're adding so much compost. That's that organic matter that is going to improve our clay soil. Okay, so remember back on this slide, we were talking about aerobes and micro aerophiles, and how aerobes need that 21% oxygen, and those bacteria and protista that live underneath the soil need less oxygen because they're in the soil. So when we till the soil, and remember, we're trying not to till the soil very much in a regenerative farming system, and this is why. When we till the soil, we are burying the oxygen-loving organisms, putting them down into the soil and thus killing them. And we are exposing oxygen-shy organisms to the top of the soil, and we're doing that whole mix. And so we are killing both of them, essentially. We're killing the ones that love to be above ground and like the oxygen. We're putting them down below the earth where there is no oxygen and killing them. And then we are taking the ones that don't like very oxygen-rich environments and bringing them to the surface, and then we're killing them too. Why people till often is because this influx of oxygen quickly results in an explosion of aerobic microorganisms, which speeds up the decomposition of plant residues and makes large amounts of nutrients available to the next crop, which sounds like a good thing, right? But the longer you do this, you will have less of those oxygen-shy organisms to bring up and less of those oxygen-loving organisms to bring down. Your first till will result in this explosion of aerobic microorganisms and speeding up decomposition and making nutrients available. But the more and more you till, it's kind of like taking money out of the bank. You can withdraw a whole lot at once and live large, but then you go back to the bank and there's nothing there anymore. That's the same thing with tilling. After you till that first time, you're going to have this explosion of aerobic microorganisms, and it's going to speed up the decomposition of plant residues and make lots of nutrients available to the next crop. But then you're depleted. You've withdrawn all that money out of that account, and you can't keep going back to that account anymore. So it's best to leave the soil as is and work with the natural processes as opposed to trying to till multiple times in a season. So yeah, if we till too often, this uses up all the plant residues on. Oh, I see a hand up, Doreen. You got a hand up over there?
Yes, so like if we decided to have a garden, but we're not going to do it till next year, and the soil hasn't been worked at all, and it's basically rocky, soil. So it's basically to till that now and then just take all the rocks out and leave it till next year, right?
That's a great start, and these are conversations that Tom and I have often had, because he's talking about rocky soil as well. And the best thing you can do for a garden next year is, and here's the time I contradict myself, is to till it. I'm just saying, don't till. But yes, till it once. And by once, I mean that could be a series of tills too. But when I say that, so in the farming world, when you're looking at working a piece of land, you're often doing a primary till and then a secondary till. So when I say till it once, I mean like one session of tilling, and that could be a primary till and a secondary till. Some soils you might only need to till once, but most soils you need to till more than once. So you need to get in there and do that primary till, which will chop up a lot of the sod and plants and everything else that's there. And then you wait a week or two for some of that to decompose and some of that to take root again. And then you till it again with a secondary till. And then you got a nice bed. And so when I say till it once, I mean like one series of till, and that series of till could be a primary and secondary till. All right, so then after you're done doing that tilling, it's never a good idea to leave your soil just open and bare for a long period of time. For a couple of weeks here and there, not a big deal. That's our stale seed bed technique. But I wouldn't till it and just leave it open for next year. Well, one, you ever hear that saying about nature abhors a vacuum? And every time nature has just an empty canvas like that, all sorts of weeds will come up. So after doing that tilling, you have a couple of options. You can add mulch to it in order to keep it covered, or you can do a cover crop, and I lean towards that cover crop. So there's all sorts of different cover crops to choose from. It depends on what you're trying to achieve and the time of year that you're looking at sowing it, and whether or not it's going to kill by itself over the winter, or whether or not you want it to come back next spring. There's all sorts of cover crops to choose from, and I can help you choose the right cover crop for your environment. But the best thing you can do to prepare a garden for next year, try to bring this all back here, is to do that tilling this year, and then cover crop it, and then grow a nice big lush cover crop of, yesterday I was talking to Tom about buckwheat. Buckwheat will grow about waist high, and will have a nice leafy, it produces a lot of leaf, and therefore produces a lot of like plant material and organic matter. So if you do your tilling, seed it down with buckwheat. Buckwheat grows up to about waist high, nice big lush plants over the entire spot. Buckwheat, as soon as the first frost comes, buckwheat's dead. It just kills itself, and it'll just lie right down on top of your soil. And then next spring, when you go in there, you might find you don't need to till at all anymore. You have the buckwheat have died back, and you can just either plant or make your raised beds at that point. And that is the absolute best thing you can do for a garden for next year, is to start it this year by doing that initial till, and then doing the cover cropping, and then in theory, never tilling again.
Thank you.
So yeah, this is like my bank analogy here, that if we till too often, that uses up all the plant residues on the surface, and ultimately can destroy that humus layer on the soil. When we talk about humus, we're talking about that organic component of soil formed by the decomposition of leaves and other plant material by soil microorganisms. The more we till, the more we disturb that process. And then all of a sudden your garden is not incorporating that mulch into your garden anymore, because you've killed all those soil microorganisms that do that work for you. And so if we till too often and we don't add more organic matter in the form, in the form of plant residues or compost, then we can deplete entirely that soil of that humus layer and its fertility. So going back to that bank analogy, every time you till, you're making a withdrawal out of that bank. In order to put money back into that bank, you're looking at adding more organic matter in the form of plant residues or compost, mulch, essentially, or compost. Yeah. And the stage of development we're at here at Hayes Farm in year number 4 is we are not tilling and adding more things to that, putting more money into the bank by adding all that organic matter to our soil. And that's certainly helpful here because of our heavy clay soils that we're trying to work with and remediate. Here's another good quote. Soil biodiversity and ecosystem health is always greatest in undisturbed soils. I think most of us know that intuitively. Big healthy rainforests that haven't been disturbed in thousands of years are nice healthy places to be, that's for sure. Another quote, organic farmers across the world are finding that their yields and crop health continue to increase through no-till practices. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in the regenerative farming world. So another ecosystem element is water. Water can compose up to 90% of the body weight of some organisms. The human body is 65% water. Living beings don't just need water, we are made out of water. And too little water in an ecosystem slows down microbial activity, and then slows down the breakdown of organic matter, and then that will deprive your plants of nutrients from the decay of organic matter. I was saying in our compost talk there that sometimes I water my compost and my kids look at me funny, like, why are you watering the compost? And that's the reason there. If your compost gets too dry, you're going to slow down microbial activity, and therefore that microbial activity won't be working to break down that organic matter that you're supplying that compost. And so you need water in order to aid those microbes to do their thing. Heidi in her book talks about the fact that 65% of the human body is water, and there are 8 billion of us on the planet. So humans of themselves are a heck of a reservoir for water, right? We actively, by moving humans around the planet, we are actively moving water around the planet. An interesting thing to think about. And if we deprive a plant of water, it of course withers and dies. If we deprive the soil of water, same thing happens. The soil organisms can die out if they get too dry, but they also just slow down too. And so the processes they perform slow down as well. And then the plants don't have as much access to nutrients they require, and then your plants can become sick. So depriving a plant of water, of course, it withers and dies, but depriving the soil of water affects the soil organisms, which are feeding your plants. So you got to make sure that your soil organisms have enough water to perform the functions that they're supposed to perform. And this is why I don't like my drip tape. I bought into the whole drip tape world many years ago, and a lot of certified organic farms uses the drip tape, and a lot of people are very happy with their drip tape. But the drip tape only delivers water to your plants. If you think about it, we're laying 2 lines on top of each bed, and all of our pathways are then deprived of water. And this is why I want to switch the garden over, our different field blocks over to a micro sprinkler system. And that's something I want to move forward with hopefully this year. It's just a matter of finding time to work it all out. And I actually have a micro sprinkler system in mind. I've been down this road a little bit in the wintertime. And when we get into our working with water class, we'll dive down deeper into that, but what I think the ideal irrigation system should be. But this is the reason why I want to move away from drip tape. But we just have all of the gear for drip tape that I brought with me from my old operation. This didn't cost us any money, and it's been cheap to set up. But the more established we get at Hayes Farm, the more I want to get away from drip tape and get onto an overhead micro irrigation system. All right, last ecosystem element we're going to discuss here is temperature. And when we were in our composting talk, we were talking about different bacteria and how they work at different temperatures. And that's the reason why your food goes bad in your fridge, because there's bacteria that works at temperatures of 5 degrees Celsius and less. And they work slower than the bacteria that works at, say, 20 degrees and above. If you had a nice bowl of spaghetti made and you put one in the fridge and leave one on the countertop, the one on the countertop is going to go bad considerably quicker, because those bacteria that work at higher temperatures are much more active. But still, there's bacteria that work at very low temperatures. And here they say microbes act as cold-blooded creatures completely dependent on temperature to function. Absolutely, I'll agree with that. If that bacteria that operates at above 20 degrees is kept in the fridge, it's pretty much dormant until it hits that 20 degrees again. It'll stay alive, but it's pretty much dormant. It doesn't do its function at the low temperature. Likewise, those bacteria that operate at 5 degrees Celsius and less, if they're exposed to higher temperatures, they don't function either. There's different bacteria in nature by function and design, by ecosystem function and design, I should say, that operate all sorts of different temperature ranges, and they all kind of work together. And here's a good quote at the very bottom here. The metabolic activity within the soil environment doubles for every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, until the temp gets so high that the proteins are denatured and then organisms die. So our takeaway for that is every 10 degrees that the soil warms up. Remember, we got our soil thermometer here. And every 10 degrees that the soil warms up, the activity within that soil environment doubles. This time of year, when our soil is cool, there is not as much activity in our soil as in the middle of summer when our soil is nice and warm. Therefore, if we were to plant some plants, like think about your heat-loving plants, your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplants, your cucumbers, your melons, all of them like warm temperatures. That's because they operate and receive the nutrients they need at those warmer temperatures. If they're in cool soil, they're not going to receive those nutrients that they need, because those organisms are simply inactive at that time in the soil. So if you're growing, you could start out with a nice healthy melon plant, But if the soil is cool, that melon plant's going to get sick and die because it's not receiving the nutrients it needs, because the nutrients it depends on is processed by the microbes and bacteria that operate at the higher temperatures. Hope that makes sense. And then as that activity increases in the soil, that metabolic activity, that all that bacteria and organisms in the soil, as that activity increases with temperature, those microbes also need more water. As microbes continue to multiply, they become more water dependent as their populations increase. And basically the takeaway from that is the higher the temperatures, the higher the requirement is for water, which is pretty self-explanatory, I think. I think everybody has seen that already. Dallas, you got something?
I was just curious if it's like common practice for like larger level farms, if they have their greenhouses that are built, do they usually have like the mini splits or whatever, like the heaters and stuff in one part to kind of maintain a specific temperature, like something like that? Or
Yep.
Because similar to what we do, like we're creating like a climate within a row cover.
Yep.
Like they would typically have like two different parts, right? Like two different actual areas. Yeah.
I got a behind the scenes look at Richter's greenhouse in Ontario. Richter's is a middle-sized seed company, I guess, and they have different greenhouses. They operate like multiple greenhouses. I don't know, maybe 12 to 15 they have on the site. And yeah, it depends on what's in their greenhouse. They operate them at different temperatures, especially during the winter. They have plants that they overwinter, and they tuck them in real tight into their hottest greenhouse, and then the other ones they allow to get a little bit cooler. But yeah, certainly big greenhouse operations will certainly have different zones and different temperatures in different greenhouses. And again, though, like on our kind of level that we operate, we're trying to hit more of those. We're growing so many different plants all in one greenhouse, so we're trying to hit like those averages, but that is the whole point of the tent in the greenhouse, is to increase the temperature and even the soil temperature in those planters to a certain level where this kind of stuff happens, that the plants that we are growing in there, the heat loving plants, are going to be able to receive the nutrients that they need.
Would there, sorry.
No, good.
Would there be, so, because we're currently using the row cover, there's obviously probably going to be some heat loss from that.
No, heat gain.
Heat gain, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Just
row cover increases temperature and humidity.
Okay. Because I wasn't sure like how efficient it was on maintaining temperature, as opposed to if you were going to do kind of like the hot box style greenhouse, kind of what we were talking about before. If you would have built that inside instead of using specifically like the row cover.
Hot frame, sure, would definitely, absolutely, positively provide more temperatures. Your row cover is, and you can Google this, but I think it's providing like 1 to 2 degrees Celsius difference plus. And sometimes though, that's enough. That's all a plant needs. Right now, I got an interesting experiment happening at my place. I did some pasture management, tilled a couple of different areas to grow cover crops in order for my chickens to forage through later on in the summer. And so one of these pastures that I managed is all fenced in. And so I rototilled that, and then I seeded it down with cover crops, and they're growing well. Then there was another pasture that I was managing that does not benefit from having a fence around it. So I covered that with row cover just to keep the chickens and ducks off of it, because it just same reason we have row cover over here. It just looks unnatural, and deer and groundhogs don't necessarily go through the row cover to get to plants, but they will, but they don't often. So anyway, okay. I have this one patch with no row cover on it, and I have this other patch with row cover on it. I seeded cover crops in both. I used a bit of cover crop cocktail, about 5 different species of plants in both. And the one that I have row covered is like 2 to 3 times ahead of the one I don't have row covered. And row cover is great to use this year, not only for the insect control and then the 4-legged animal control and to keep moisture underneath, but it's also great for temperature control too this time of year. Just that 1 or 2 degrees temperature makes a big difference.
How long would you keep your row cover on?
Until it warms up outside. Well, it depends on what's under there. So right now we have row cover over top of onions, and the onions don't necessarily like need it. And same with the chard, they don't necessarily need it. But it is helping us out with mammals. There's not so many insects we have to worry about with those crops. But the temperature is helping us out. And that temperature increase is helping us out. And so we will leave the row cover on. I don't know, we'll see, at least another week yet, but we'll see when it starts warming up on a regular basis, we'll consider taking it off some crops. But for now, we're definitely going to leave it on until maybe our overnight temperatures are a little bit more stable, perhaps. I kind of feel it out, I'll be honest, and feels too soon yet. So we were talking about temperature and how temperature affects the activity and the life in the soil. And for every 10 degrees Celsius that the soil increases, the activity in that soil doubles. And so Heidi here calls that nature's just-in-time nutrient delivery system. The nutrients become available to plants just as they are required. Like I was saying, some plants thrive in cool temperatures, and that means that the soil organisms and soil life that they require also thrives at that low temperatures, and there's that whole relationship happening. Whereas some other plants are heat-loving plants. They thrive when the soil temperature gets hotter because they depend on those soil organisms, soil microorganisms that only wake up when that soil is warmer. And so Heidi calls that the just-in-time nutrient delivery system. And here again, just to keep referencing this and underlining it, nutrients are made available primarily through the activity of microbes. And that's what we're trying to farm here is our microbes. And that is what will break down the organic matter to produce these nutrients that our plants will then benefit from. You're not feeding compost to your plant, you're feeding compost to the microbes. As the microbes break down that compost, you're feeding the plant. So here again is a bit of a approach, different approaches between like organic farming versus regenerative farming, and you can go conventional farming further down that spectrum too. We can either choose to supply nutrients directly to the plants, which is that conventional ag approach, often using synthetic water-soluble fertilizers. Or we can choose to optimize the soil fertility overall and let the microbes do the fertilizing, which is that regenerative farming approach. And then I just have a note here from our composting talk. There are no organic fertilizers. According to the Canadian Fertilizer Act, everything in the organic world is so low in nutrients that they're not considered fertilizers. They can't even be sold as fertilizers compared to the synthetic fossil fuel based fertilizers. So in the regenerative farming world, we're trying to provide ample organic matter in forms of compost and mulch, which is going to feed our soil microbes, which is going to feed our plants. That's all chapter 1. Oh my goodness, it brought us almost to 10:30 here. That's all right. Chapter 2 is all about soil relationships, and I do want to get into a little bit of this here. We were talking about that soil texture triangle, and that's going to come up in just a second. In our composting talk, we were talking about like what actually is soil, and soil is derived from the breakdown of rock and organic matter. Heidi's take on this is that soil is the result of the interaction between 3 equal partners. You have the abiotic components, which are your rocks and minerals, your living organisms, and then the environmental components, which is your temperature, air, and water. And our job as soil managers is to manage those relationships between those 3 partners, between that abiotic component, between the organisms, and between the environmental components. So when we talk about the abiotic components, we're talking about sand, silt, clay. Remember, we were talking about this in the soil texture triangle. Sand, silt, clay comes from the breakdown of various types of rocks and minerals by that environmental piece, that air, wind, and water. But right now we're going to focus on the abiotics here. So they each of those sand, silt, and clay all bring different qualities to a soil partnership. Rarely do you have a soil that is 100% sand or 100% silt or 100% clay. More often there's a bit of a mix between it all, but it can be sand dominant or silt dominant or clay dominant, such as our soil here at the farm is definitely clay dominant. But it's not, rarely is it ever 100% clay, you know? You have to process that. You have to do some refining in order to get 100% sand, silt, or clay. So sand, though, we'll start with that. Sand is that largest particle size. I was comparing it to our bag of perlite over here. Under a microscope, it looks much like that perlite. It is very coarse and angular, and therefore it drains the quickest. But it also has the opportunity to provide the most oxygen and air to plant roots. Now, when I talk about air and plant roots, this might sound like a contradiction here, because I always say that air kills plant roots, and it does. If you are transplanting a plant and you have an air pocket, the plant roots will kind of grow around that air pocket, and they won't go through that air pocket so much. Just like that's the whole reason about those soil blocks that we were talking about in the greenhouse that one day. The soil blocks, when the plant roots start to go out of the soil blocks and get air, that they'll naturally just kind of self-trim themselves. You can, of course, if they're, I'm sure you've seen roots come out of like the bottom of pots of plants, but in that kind of circumstance, they're not exposed to direct air. They're often sandwiched at the bottom of the tray, and they're often very moist. So it's not just like straight air that they're getting, because straight air, like I was saying, will essentially prune those roots of the plants. But if those roots are trapped underneath the pot in the tray, then they're staying moist, staying dark, and you don't have much to worry about. But anyway, takeaway here is plants do need air, and they do need oxygen as they're in the soil. And that's why we get into that difference between anaerobic soil and aerobic soil. We do not want anaerobic soil because there is no air there for plant roots. Sand here, being the largest particle size, will provide that most air to your plant roots. Silts, though, can be compared to very tiny grains of sand, and they are so small that they can remain suspended in liquid or air for quite a period of time. And in terms of functionality, they're kind of in between the sand and the clay, but in a microscope, they look like just tiny grains of sand. And again, they have silt typically will have good drainage, but not as much as sand, and can provide air to plant roots as well, but not as much as sand as well. Clay, though, when you look at it under a microscope, are very small, very flat, sheet-like particles, not sheet-like particles, sheet-like particles they can compact very easily. And because they're so sheet-like and can compact, and they're so stacked on top of each other, they are the slowest to drain, and potentially can provide the least amount of air to plant roots. But the good thing about clay here is that clay also has the potential to have the highest nutrients out of any of those soils, out of the sand and silt. Clay has the ability to absorb, and if you're treating it right, release nutrients to your plants. Clay is quite rich in nutrients. All right, so here's our soil texture. Yeah, what do you got?
Okay, say if you have clay, okay, and then you make a clay smoothie, can you put that clay smoothie on your plants, on your soil?
Clay smoothie, that's very interesting. See,
Like,
typically I don't.
Clay?
Yeah, I mean, typically I don't like to take soil from someplace else and then put it on your garden. But you're talking, yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that, Doreen.
Okay.
But clay does have the most nutrients. I would typically, though, if you're trying to remediate a soil, I always advocate for, and because much of the literature I look at always advocates for just adding more organic matter. And this here soil texture triangle will kind of hopefully help explain that. This soil texture triangle, in one corner you got silt, one corner you got sand, and the other corner you got clay. As I was saying, there's no such thing as just like 100%. Well, there is, I guess, but not in nature. You don't often see 100% clay, silt, or sand. It's usually a combination. Like sometimes it's silty clay. That's what you got over here. And you got sandy clay over here. But the magic spot where we're all trying to get to is this loamy soil. That's the best for gardening, is this loamy soil. And in order to get to that loamy soil, the best thing you can do is keep adding more organic matter. And there's various ways of adding organic matter to your soil, such as through compost and through mulch, or through growing that green living cover crop and incorporating that into your soil is adding a ton of organic matter, literally tons of organic matter to your soil in the form of those plant leaves. And so as opposed to importing, like if you have a sandy soil, as opposed to importing clay, all the literature and everything always recommends just adding more organic matter, because if you have clay soil or silty soil or sandy soil, the more and more organic matter you add, you're going to keep going to the middle of this triangle and working your way towards this loamy soil. And you can see here just like the wording definitions here, from sand and then to loamy sand, and then to sandy loam, which is closer to your loam, and then over to your loam. That's, everything always recommends just keep adding more organic matter until you get to this loamy soil that you're trying to achieve. What did I have there? It's triangle, yeah. Okay, so that first part was all about the abiotic components of soil. The second part here is all about the living organisms. The second part here is all about living organisms in the soil. Did anybody have something there? Okay, so living organisms affect the soil by converting carbon and nitrogen gas into solid compounds. They can modify the soil fertility through biological transmutation, fancy words, conversion of mineral soil nutrients into organic forms, creation of multi-level food production and storage systems, creation of habitat through structural improvement of the soil. We're not going to talk about those very much, but essentially, living organisms can greatly affect the soil, as you can imagine. Earthworms crawling through the soil will affect the soil. Ants tunneling through the soil is going to affect the soil. Groundhogs digging through the soil is going to affect the soil. Animals pooping on the surface of the soil and underneath the soil is going to affect the soil. But all of these concepts we're going to explore in our working with soil class, so we'll park those for now. There's also the environmental components that affect the soil, such as temperature, air, and water. As we are already talking about, temperature stimulates biological processes. The higher the temperature of the soil, the more metabolic activity that is in that soil. Air, of course, will affect wind and erosion effects on rocks, and air, of course, is a carrier of oxygen and nitrogen, which both influences soil fertility and soil microbe populations. And water, again, can cause that erosion effect, break down that abiotic component of the soil. And water, of course, supplies hydrogen and oxygen, good old H2O. And then that will essentially create acids needed for organisms to mine the soil. So yeah, you got your three different partners there in your soil: your abiotic, your living organisms, and your environmental components. Soil, of course, as we were talking about in the soil food web, is a whole ecosystem in and of itself. Rock by itself is not soil. Sand, silt, or clay itself is not soil. Living organisms themselves are not soil, and their remains, their poop there, is not soil. Air, water, and temperature are not soil, but when you combine all of these things, you get soil. So the real work of creating soil structure and soil habitat is done by the organisms that live in our soil, and our job is to support them. That's the very regenerative farming point of view. So that was a little bit of an overview on chapter 2, soil relationships. Now we're into chapter 3, which is water relationships. And we will take a deeper dive into these water relationships in our working with water class in the near future. But for now, we'll go over a couple of basic concepts so we can continue through the book and with some understanding. Heidi likes to say that there is no such thing as pure water in nature. And I was talking about this during our greenhouse class, and I was talking about salts. Remember, I was talking about what happens when every time you water shallowly and all that water evaporates, it's going to leave behind that salt residue. But here Heidi is taking it a step further and saying that there's more than just salt, of course, in water. Water carries all sorts of things with it. And those substances carried by that water moves through the environment, whether we want them to or not. Of course, all life is dependent on water. And then water movement within the ecosystems, which I find fascinating, by the way, I love that topic, is a completely interplay between water, soil, gravity, living organisms, temperature, and air. And we need to understand these relationships if we want to manage water effectively. This here, chapter 3, water relationships, explores the relationships between those variables from 3 different perspectives. They talk about soil and water relationships, plant and water relationships, and the carrying capacity of water. So let's start with soil and water relationships. This here explains how, well, attempts to explain how water moves through soil. And the answer to that is water will move through soil in all directions. It'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go horizontal, it'll go in all directions through the soil. Gravity will help pull water downwards through the soil. When it gets too dry outside, the water moves up from down below and what's the word I'm looking for? Transpires through the soil, and that's how you get evaporation. And then water will also move horizontally through the soil, whether it's over the landscape through rivers and streams and puddles and things like that, or it moves horizontally through the soil itself due to the adhesion properties of water. And we'll get into adhesion and cohesion more on our working with water class. So we'll park that for the time being. When we talk about the carrying capacity of water, we're talking about all the things that water can carry with it. Yeah, so picture a heavy rain event where it rains and rains and rains. Well, we've had lots of those lately, and the ground is completely saturated. Well, we're kind of completely saturated around here. And so the water can't go into the soil anymore. And so when water is applied faster than it can be absorbed into soil, it's going to travel over top of the land. And there are factors that will influence that, which is your soil type. Sandy soil, like I was saying, will drain much faster than clay soil. And our clay soil here is saturated. So when it rains, the water tends to collect and pool and then run, as opposed to at home where I got sandy, silty soil. When it waters, it tends to drain. I don't have puddles around in my place, hardly ever. Completely different soil types. The vegetation that's around is going to influence water, of course, and the way the water runs over top of your land. The organic matter present in your soil will greatly influence how much water that soil can absorb. And I got some great stats on that we'll dive into in our working with water class, and how saturated the soil is to begin with, such as like around here, we are 100% saturated someplace. And every time water leaves an ecosystem after it collects in puddles and starts to run over land, it always takes substances with it suspended in the water. And these substances can travel great distances. And we're talking about things like organic matter and minerals and nutrients, and sometimes on conventional farms, pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers too, of course, can travel along with that water as it travels over the surface of the land. And of course, water in very large amounts is capable of moving some very big solid substances, such as rocks or twigs or branches over distances. Okay, so yeah, when water does infiltrate through the soil, that is when it's applied at a rate that is not overwhelming and completely saturating the soil. It's applying at a rate where it is infiltrating through the soil and going downwards through by the force of gravity. Water still carries with it things, often very fine soil particles and your nutrients. It'll carry, so right now we are top dressing a lot with compost. When it does rain and that water is able to seep into our soil, it's carrying that nutrients from the compost down to feed those organisms deeper into the soil. It's also carrying very fine soil particles downwards as well. And after decades, centuries, millennia of this, we end up with soil horizons. And I'm sure some of you have probably seen pictures like this. You have your very top layer, which is your litter layer, and then you have your topsoil underneath it. Then you have what's called in this diagram, the leaching layer, and then subsoil, and then weathered material and parent material down here. I'm not sure if anybody has ever dug a soil pit, but I always find that fascinating. Or anytime you dig a hole and you see the different layers of soil, and that's your soil horizons. And that is naturally going to happen over a long period of time due to the water hitting that soil and then going downwards and carrying things with it like fine soil particles. Okay, so the last relationship we're going to talk about here is the plant-water relationship. Of course, plants require water as a constituent of their body and for breathing and for photosynthesis. But how does water actually move through plants? The very tops of a 100-foot tree needs water in order to form those leaves at the very top of that tree, but it does so against the force of gravity. And that's a fascinating thing to dive into, and we will dive into it in our working with water class. It's all about tension and negative pressure, and it's very interesting stuff, and we'll get into that into the future. But for now, it's you got to think that, you know, of course, water never disappears. It's constantly being transformed and recycled. So the question is here, what happens to the water after the plants are done with it? And so I'm sure everybody's had an experience where it's a hot summer day and you find yourself a nice cool, say, cedar grove to go into, and the temperature is like 10 degrees difference. And that's because the cedars, well, A, are blocking the sun, and then B, they're releasing that water that has traveled to the top of the cedar and every place in between. They're releasing that water by vapor through what's called the stomata on their leaves. And the humidity is higher often in some of these, in some of the areas underneath these trees, and the temperature can be substantially lower. So plants have the ability to alter temperatures and moisture levels in an ecosystem. And I'm sure everybody's had some experience with that, going into a nice shady spot on a nice hot day, and the temperature and moisture levels are different in the shade, that's for sure. All right, so that's chapter 3, working with our chapter 3, water relationships. Chapter 4 is all about working with water. So previous we were talking about relationships, and now we're here in chapter 4, we're talking about how to put these principles into practice. And again, when we get to the working with water class, which I don't think is next Thursday, but I made a mistake there. But anyway, when we get to the working with water class, we'll talk more about how these principles actually behave in practice. Some concepts here is that essentially ecosystems are communal water collection and storage devices, whether you're talking about the soil surface, whether you're talking about soil formations, the living organisms themselves, the terrain and topography, the temperature and air. The entire ecosystems is a big water collection and storage device, is how you should look at it. So if we want water in our man-made ecosystem, when by man-made ecosystem, we're talking about gardens or farms, we need to work with those same natural processes. If we want to collect water and store water, we might be looking at making tweaks to the soil surface, such as our berm and such as a berm and swale, or a ditch, or our switch, as we call it. Soil formations is something else that can be worked with. Living organisms is something else that can be worked with. Establishing multi-story vegetation where you're growing different crops underneath other crops and doing companion planting is another way we can work with water. Temperature and air, terrain and topography. We'll talk more about those in our working with water class though, so I'm not going to spend much time on it now. Working with soil, again, we have a class on this into the near future, just diving into the working with soil, but just some very broad brush strokes here. When we talk about soil management, we're talking about relationship management. Every landscape, every individual farm, every individual garden, every individual field block here is a unique ecosystem. So too many gardeners, especially too many beginner gardeners, are looking for like the answers. You know, what do I do to make my garden, my farm, my whatever great? But there is no silver bullet. There is no one list of answers. It's a matter of understanding your ecosystem and deciding what is right for your ecosystem. What one person is doing on their garden or farm and doing extremely well for them on their garden or farm might not work for you on your garden or farm. So it's up to you to kind of understand the ecosystem which within your farm operates, and then decide what are the appropriate tasks to do in that ecosystem for your garden or farm. And as I was saying about the soil food web, it's not our job to assume those tasks that rightfully belong to those soil organisms in the soil. It's not our task. It's not our job to assume the tasks that rightfully belong to the soil partners, but instead we create the conditions that allow them to complete their natural ecological functions. That is that regenerative farming approach. So when we look at soil and working with soil, basically we're looking at, Heidi identifies 4 different ways to create conditions to allow those soil partners to complete their natural ecological functions. We can supplement missing essential nutrients, which is the very conventional farming approach, and also a certified organic approach is just to supply the missing essential nutrients directly to our plants. Or we can provide appropriate organic matter for the soil organisms to feed the soil organisms, which then are going to make nutrients available to the plants. We can look at ways to increase soil biodiversity. We can look at ways to stimulate biological processes within the soil. And again, we'll dive more into those in our working with soil class, and I find all those things fascinating. Yeah, I don't think I want to talk about that. Here is when we talk about providing appropriate organic matter for soil microorganisms. Here are some common microbe foods. We talk a lot about mulch here, and we use barley straw as mulch. But here are some other options, because folks are always looking for other options. Nature's own mulch, which of course are like leaves that fall from trees. Grass clippings is another great one. Leaf mold, which is breakdown of piles of leaves, create this leaf mold, which is a fantastic microbe food. Compost, of course, talked a lot about that. Ramial chipped wood, and that's the tips, the active living tips of hardwood trees. And you're trying to clip just the tips, not the bark, not the trunk, not the big branches, but just the tips. And you can put those through a wood chipper, and those make excellent microbe foods. The bark and like heavy woody material and big branches of a tree will absorb nitrogen in the garden, but those tips have a whole different buildup. There's a whole different set of enzymes that are in those tips, and those tips make excellent food for your garden. Peat and coir, we talked about peat. Coir is your coconut fiber. Bark mulch, wood chips, sawdust, straw, and hay. Some of these are better than others. We'll take a deeper dive into that in our working with soil class. Ways to increase soil microbiome. Yeah, I'm gonna park a lot of these for our working with soil class. Chapter 6 of Heidi's book is about diagnosing ecosystem needs. So up to this point in the book, we're talking about different relationships with water, relationships with soil, and then how to work with water and how to work with soil. And then in chapter 6, she talks about how to diagnose what your ecosystem actually needs. So we're moving here at this point in the book, we're moving away from fertility management options and water management options, and moving towards trying to diagnose what your ecosystem actually needs. Heidi identifies various tests that you can use to diagnose your ecosystem needs. And she breaks these down into 5 different categories. There's the soil texture and soil structure test, soil biology tests, soil nutritional properties tests, a test to detect energy flow within ecosystems, and a test for plant and ecosystem health. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on these, but we'll go through these a little bit. Soil and soil texture and structure. So yeah, remember back to that soil triangle. The question is, how do you determine if you have sandy or silty or clay soil? And like I was saying, there's very rarely 100% of each, but it's more often a mix between the two. And so how do you determine what your mix is? Well, first of all, why do you want to determine what your mix is? That is because knowing your soil structure can tell you a lot about the soil properties. Knowing your soil structure will tell you how much water holding capacity your soil has. Like I was saying, clay soil is able to retain water much better than sandy soils. And some plants like that, and some plants don't. Knowing that you have clay soil versus sandy or silty soil, dominant soils, will tell you a lot of information about that water infiltration rate on your garden plot. Your sandy and silty soils will be able to supply oxygen much more readily to soil dwelling organisms than your clay soil will. And then, yeah, so then she goes on to say that all of those things there also depend on the organic matter that is in the soil. And when you do a soil structure test, and I'm about to get into a couple of tests that you can do, it gives you absolutely zero information about the organic matter that is in the soil. But that organic matter that is in the soil can be addressed with soil biological tests, and we'll get into that in just a second. So first, here is your soil texture test. This here is called the sediment test, and you guys might have heard about this already. What you're doing is you're filling a jar about 1/3 of the way full with soil, and tall, slender jars are best for this experiment. You add cold water until the jar is about 3/4 full. You're adding a little bit of dish soap, and then you close the jar and you shake it vigorously for 10 to 15 minutes, and then you set the jar down and monitor. So this here is a very inexpensive way to do a soil texture test. All of the organic matter will float to the top. And then after about 60 seconds or so, all of the sand will settle out. And then after 30 minutes, all of the silt will settle out, and you'll end up with different layers at the bottom of your jar. You'll have the sand layer first and then the silt layer. Clay particles can take as much as 24 hours or even longer to settle out. And by the time you're done, by the time this jar is all settled out a day or two later, all of your layers will be distinct. And then you can indicate your percent sand, silt, and clay in the soil by just doing this simple jar test. Isn't that neat? Another test that I often do is called the ribbon test. And here you're just taking enough soil from the ground to make a 1/2-inch ball. You don't want any gravel or organic matter or debris in there. Ideally, you're just trying to get some soil from a little bit further underneath. You want to have this at the right consistency. You're going to need to squeeze it into a ball. Back when I was taking a soil science class once upon a time in college, they actually told you to spit on it. But you can do whatever you want to do to get that right consistency. You want it to be kind of a putty-like consistency, not too wet, but not too dry, kind of like silly putty. And then you want to be able to squeeze a ribbon out between your thumb and forefinger. And if you can't squeeze out any ribbon whatsoever, chances are you got sandy soil or a sandy loam soil. Think about having a handful of sand in your hand, even if it's wet sand. As soon as you go like this with your sandy soil, and that's your ribbon test, you just gotta squeeze it out. The sand is just gonna fall apart. That's all sand does. But if you have a very small ribbon, chances are you're moving into a sandy loam or a silty loam or loamy soil. If you got like that 1 to 2 inch ribbon, you're looking at more sandy clay or silty clay or clay loam. And if you got longer ribbons, you're looking at more clay soils. So that's the ribbon test. And I'm always playing with soil like that in my hand and trying to do that ribbon test. So that's soil texture tests. If you want to get into soil structure tests, she has a couple here. And with each of her tests, she offers a very low tech, low barrier entry kind of tests. And then she offers higher tech one. And so here with a soil structure test, she's talking about something as simple as just poking a length of rebar into the soil. Is it easy or difficult to penetrate? And some of this will take a little bit of experience and familiarity with the soil, but it gives you an idea of possible soil compaction or not. And then there are instruments called a penetrometer, sure. And then that you can plug into the soil, and that will give you a very good indication of soil compaction or not. I've never seen one of those in real life, but apparently they exist. Here's another test that she gives, which involves pounding a pipe into the soil. And then it also involves water and plastic wrap over top of it. And then all of a sudden you remove the plastic wrap really quick. And there's a bit of science going on here. You want an exact amount of water that you want to trap in that plastic wrap in that pipe. And then you remove that plastic wrap and quickly hits the soil. And then you get an infiltration rate out of this soil test. I'm not going to spend very much time on it. If you want to look more into this kind of soil test, it's in here in this book, which will be in the library. I just want to kind of let you know that this test exists, and it lets you know how quickly water will infiltrate into your soil. Here's a test that you can do. If you want to test soil biology, here is one ultra low test where you're simply getting down on your hands and knees with a magnifying glass and you're seeing what you can see. Are there different insects? What color is the topsoil? Smelling the soil, and I'm always smelling the soil as well. You don't want that sour smell. You want a nice earthy kind of smelling soil. High-tech soil biology test. Is Docteur in Quebec. I think I might have talked about this place previously. If you Google it, you'll definitely get a hit. A woman named Vivian something, I forget her last name. Anyway, she runs a lab in Quebec called Docteur. And most soil tests, when you send them away, will give you your different nutrient analysis, what's in your soil, your NPK, and some of your micro nutrients as well. But this Docteur, she does a test to let you know how much living organisms are in your soil. And I find that fascinating. That's the only one I've ever heard of that does this kind of thing. I've never actually sent a soil test away to her, but I think it's fascinating that it exists. And that's the kind of soil test I'd be more interested in than just that nutrient analysis myself, is that test in soil biology. Because from that regenerative farming point of view, the more biology you have present in your soil, the healthier your soil is going to be. Because that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to farm here, is those soil microbes and bacteria. Soil nutritional property tests. Yeah, so anyway, in this chapter 6 that I'm now going to be flying through here, there's all sorts of tests from infrared she talks about, different photography effects, dowsing even she talks about. But yeah, there's all sorts of different tests that you can do, and it's all outlined in this book, which is available in the library. Chapter 7 in this book is all about working with energy. And I find this chapter so fascinating that this year we made a whole class around that chapter called Working with Energy. And we'll take a deeper dive into it then. There's a bit of an overview here in the slideshow if you're interested in going down this rabbit hole. Fascinating stuff, but we will be spending a class here. I wanted to go through quick. I'll keep going through quick. I love this here talk about how sound energy can affect the ecosystem, and we'll get into that. Insects and energy, she talks about plants and energy, soil and energy, fascinating stuff. The last chapter of the book is all called about working with health, and it identifies and talks about the effects of pesticide use on humans and the environment, various plants' defenses and strategies against diseases and insects attacks and various things like that. What to do when plants get sick. And then she talks about the concept of weeds and invasive plants. and how weeds are, weeds are just plants that you don't want in your garden. Like, well, they're just plants that are growing in the wrong spot. There's really no such thing as weeds. And that's the way you kind of should look at it. They're just plants that are growing in the wrong spots, and weeds can all be your friends. Anyway, I'm going to park it there. We are at 11 o'clock. I took you through this whole book quickly towards the end. If you want any more deeper dive into the book, it's going to be available here in our library. Fascinating stuff. Like I said, it's a bit of our playbook here at Hayes Farm. A lot of what I do is influenced by Heidi Hermary's writing here, and of course other research and other talking with other humans and this kind of stuff. But this book has definitely taught me a lot. It's fascinating. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Does anybody have any questions or whatnot at this time? I realize I've been PowerPointing to you quite a bit and talking fast and trying to get us through this book, and I hope you're able to absorb it. If you want to go back through the slideshow a little bit slower, of course, it's available to you in that Google Drive. Yep, that's what I got. You guys got anything? Going once, going twice. All right, so I will see y'all on farm in and around 12:30. Thanks, guys. Hope that wasn't too much, too top down, too top heavy for you. Bye for now.
Later.
See you later.
See ya.